This is a topic. This is an article that um, that Bing Princess found and shared in another server that I thought would be worth discussing for sure. Claudette Colvin. So a little bit of background real quick. A couple weeks ago, on our full Martin Luther King Jr. speech stream, we talked about, or we went over one of the speeches wherein King mentioned that he was glad that being asked to move was done to Mrs. Rosa Parks because she was had such integrity and had such a high opinion, or the community had such a high opinion of her, she was so well thought of, that it couldn't be rationalized away. And I found that deeply depressing because I knew he was alluding to the truth of the matter, and it's something that we also see today, which is if something unjust is done to a black person, huge swath of people will jump to do anything they can to rationalize it and say that somehow they deserved that thing happening to them. And it alluded to the fact that this had happened to many people before Rosa Parks. So let's talk about one of those people who it happened to before Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin. On March 2nd, 1955, Claudette Colvin boarded a bus home from school. 15 years old, the tiny Colvin attended Booker T. Washington High School. She'd been politicized by the mistreatment of her classmate Jeremiah Reeves and had just written a paper on the problems of downtown segregation. On the bus home that day, the white section filled up. A white woman was left standing. The driver called out, and the three students sitting in the Colvin's row got up. But Colvin refused. We'd been studying the Constitution. I knew I had rights. Sorry about that. There we go. I hit the button on the wrong screen. The standing white woman refused to sit across the aisle from her. If she sat down in the same row as me, it meant I was as good as her, Colvin noted. The driver yelled out again, "Why are you still sitting there?" Colvin recalled. A white rider yelled from the front, "You got to get up." A girl named Margaret Johnson answered from the back, "She ain't got to do nothing but stay black and die." There were 13 students on the bus that day, most of them her classmates. Again, I just want to highlight, this is 1955. There are several people who are alive today who were there, like who lived in this time, who had this attitude about a black teenager not standing up for a white woman. She ain't got to do nothing but stay black and die. When I say that, racism does still exist, yeah, exactly, Minnie. When I say that racism does still exist all over the place today, it may not be in as overt a language, but those attitudes are still present. I mean, there are still, of course, some who are just very overt about it, but those attitudes creep into a lot of different aspects of life and have continued to play absolute power over all kinds of systems, whether it be law enforcement or jobs in the market and politics and everything else. Two cops roughly arrested her and pulled her off the bus. Other black people on the bus said Colvin fought like a little tigress. Tigress? But Colvin maintained that she went limp and didn't fight back. In the patrol car, the officers mocked her and made comments about parts of her body. 15 years old, 15 years old in police custody, Colvin worried that they might try to rape her. She tried to cover her crotch and put her mind to other things. I recited Edgar Allan Poe, Annabel Lee, the characters of Midsummer's Night Dream, and The Lord's Prayer, and the 23rd Psalm. Various civil rights activists in Montgomery were outraged by the arrest and began to organize. Rosa Parks and Virginia Dunn began fundraising for young Colvin's case. More than 100 letters and a stack of donations streamed into Parks' apartment. Parks was hopeful that the young woman's arrest would embolden other young people to action and spark interest in the NAACP youth meetings. She encouraged Colvin to get active in the youth council. Black community members met with the city. Various promises were made. At the second meeting with city officials, they took a petition to the bus company and city officials which asked for more courteous treatment and no visible signs of segregation on the bus. Tired of the city's runaround, Parks refused to join them. I had decided I would not go anywhere with a piece of paper in my hand asking white folks for any favors. Colvin's case went to trial in May. Colvin had been charged with 3 crimes. Colvin. Not the people who beat the shit out of her. Not the bus driver who asked her to stand up despite her not being legally obligated to, but Colvin. The judge strategically dropped 2 of the charges for disturbing the peace and breaking the segregation law, but found her guilty on the 3rd for assaulting the officers who arrested her. And this is how, even today, many black people end up getting in trouble even when they have done nothing wrong. Because if they are being harshly handled by cops, if they resist whatsoever, they're done for. Assault against an officer. Even if whatever the officer was antagonizing them for and trying to arrest them for was a false charge. Since Colvin had only been convicted of assault, appealing her case could not directly challenge the segregation law. This is a very noodly bit of legal maneuvering because the judge dropped those charges. The community was outraged. Some people stayed off the buses, but Colvin was young and seen as feisty and uncontrollable by many adults, and lived on the wrong side of town. Ultimately, civil rights leaders deemed her not the right kind of plaintiff to organize around. How often do we see this these days? How often do people try and say, oh, George Floyd was on drugs? Or continue to make up shit about Breonna Taylor or any of the endless names of black bodies who get slaughtered. Americans still call it the hood, yeah. Yeah. There is a myth, however, that they dropped her because she was pregnant. Colvin was not pregnant when the community decided not to pursue her case. Later in the summer, Colvin found out that she had become pregnant by an older man. When this news came to light, many felt further convinced they had done the right thing in not pursuing her case. Over time, the stories would change, so Colvin would be pregnant at the time of her arrest and trial, which was not the case. You would think that, Drew, but the data hasn't borne that out. What the data shows is in the first year that body cams are deployed, usually there's a slight drop in... Well, okay, so there's two factors to that. First of all, let's start with Let me finish this essay first, and then I have some thoughts for you. According to Colvin, Mrs. Parks was the only adult leader who kept up with her that summer. Colvin had been a member of the NAACP Youth Council before the arrest and continued to attend youth council meetings. Parks made Colvin secretary of the council, trying to nurture the young woman's spirit and budding leadership. Claudette Colvin recalled that she was She only went to youth council meetings if I could get a ride, and sometimes she would stay overnight at Rose's. She lived in the projects across the street. Parks exhibited a certain forcefulness and strictness with the young people. According to Colvin, Parks was very kind and thoughtful. She knew exactly how I liked my coffee and fixed me peanut butter and Ritz crackers. I didn't say much at all. Then when the meeting started, I'd think, is this the same lady? She would come across as very strong about rights. She'd pass out leaflets saying things like, we're going to break down the walls of segregation. Parks would make Colvin tell the story of her bus arrest over and over. After a while, they'd all heard it a million times. They seemed bored with it. Colvin would become one of the plaintiffs on the federal case Browder v. Gale, filed in February 1956, like a year later, during the boycott which ultimately led to the desegregation of Montgomery's buses. So yeah. I thought that would be a interesting, if depressing, bit of history. And really, if history isn't making you uncomfortable, you're not reading history, you're reading mythology.